How does your approach to the world as a scientist affect and influence the way you approach politics?
Well, and sort of, see, I think studying science is a good way to get into fields like history.
Okay.
The reason is you learn what an argument means. Mm-hmm. You learn what evidence is. You learn, what makes sense to postulate and when. What's going to be convincing. You sort of internalize the modes of rational inquiry, which happen to be much more advanced in the sciences than anywhere else. On the other hand, applying relativity theory to history isn't going to get you anywhere.
No.
So it's a mode of mode of thinking,
Okay.
and I try, at least with what success others have to judge, to use the mode of thinking that you would use in the sciences to human affairs. And I think it's a good idea to do so.
Take a look at the managing positions, the managerial positions, the cultural managers, more or less, editors and so on. They're, first of all, very privileged themselves. They share associations and concerns with other privileged people. There's a close interaction and, in fact, a flow of people even between corporate boardrooms and government decision-making centers and media and so on. And there are many other factors, in fact, which yield the consequence that the independent media, without government coercion, there's also some of that, but even without government coercion, tend to accept and adopt as the framework for discussion the interests and concerns and the perspective of the privileged sectors of the society. That's true of the information system, it's true of the political system. The distribution of resources alone determines it. As other modes of organization and articulate expression and so on have declined, isolated individuals find themselves marginalized, and they end up voting for a ceremonial figure if they bother to vote at all.
Are you suggesting that there's a conspiracy, that there are people who gather and decide we're going to eliminate unions, we're going to eliminate popular participation in political parties, we're going to do this, we're going to do that? Is there a conspiracy?
Well, my point is, in fact, exactly the opposite. I mean, I think, and stress again, that these are institutional facts. These are the ways the institution functions. Let's go back to the chairman of the board. There's no conspiracy in the board of managers to try to raise profits and market share. In fact, if the board of managers didn't pursue that program, they wouldn't be in business any longer. It's part of the structure of the social system and the way in which the institutions function within it that they are going to be trying to maximize profit, market share, decision-making capacity, and so on.
Doing what comes naturally.
It's not that it's, yeah, it's you might say it comes naturally, because they would never have gotten to that point unless they'd internalized those values. But it's also constrained. If they stop doing it, their stock's going to decline, and so on and so forth, and somebody else will, they'll be bought up, and so on. Now, pretty much the same is true of these other institutions. If some segment of the political system, suppose we had an authentic political party reflecting the needs of the special interests, the population, it would no longer be supported. It would be denounced by the information system. It would be condemned for being anti-American or subversive and so on. It would not even have the minimal resources to keep functioning. And since we don't have a network of popular structures to sustain it, it would disappear.
You've said that the primary function of the mass media is to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. But that's not how the media see it. They claim, we claim, that our news judgments rest on unbiased, objective criteria.
Yeah,
that's how we see it.
Yeah, but in fact, the chairman of the board also sees what he is doing as a service to humanity.
You know, we like the lobster in the trap, we can't see it close behind us?
Well, the point is that no one would even make it to a high decision-making position in the media, whether as columnist or managing editor or whatever, unless they had already internalized the required values.
Internalized.
They believe them. There's a number of things you have to believe to make it to top managerial positions. You have to believe that the United States is unique in history in that it acts from benevolent motives. Now, benevolent motives are not properties of states, whether it's the United States or any other one. They don't have, it's just it's meaningless to talk about.
You're saying that the United States can act for...
I mean, it acts because of the interests of groups that have power within it, like any other society. But anyone who believes this truism is already excluded. You have to believe that whatever the United States does is defensive. If we bomb South Vietnam, we're defending South Vietnam. If the Russians invade Afghanistan, that's not defense. Now, of course, I suppose if you go to the Politburo, they'll tell you they're defending Afghanistan. They're defending it against terrorists supported from the outside. And of course, there's a, we know that they'll in fact even tell you they were invited in. And there's a kind of an element of truth to all of that, but we naturally dismiss it as nonsense. On the other hand, when we create a government in South Vietnam to invite us in, and we attack the population of South Vietnam, and we bomb people to drive them into concentration camps to separate them from the guerrillas who we concede they're supporting and so on, we're defending South Vietnam. And anyone who doesn't agree with this is not part of the system.
This is the old cabal theory that somewhere there's a room with a baize-covered desk, and there are a bunch of capitalists sitting around, and they're pulling strings. These rooms don't exist. I mean, I hate to tell Noam Chomsky this.
You don't share that.
I think it is the most absolute rubbish I've ever heard. This is the current fashion in universities. It's patent nonsense, and I think it's nothing but a fashion. It's a way that intellectuals have of feeling like a clergy. I mean, there has to be something wrong.
Well, I actually agree with that comment. I mean, the idea that there would be a high cabal running things in a country like the United States is idiotic. That would say it is like the Soviet Union. It's totally different, which is precisely why I say the exact opposite. What I'm talking about, it's like saying the corporations try to maximize profit and market share. That's not a conspiracy. That's the institutional structure of the system. Individual decisions lead to that consequence of trying to maximize profit and market share. You don't do it, you're out of business. That's not a conspiracy, and it's not a high cabal. Now, why does Wolf, or whoever it was, hear this as being a conspiracy? The point is that any analytic commentary on the institutional structure of the country is so threatening to the commissar class they can't even hear the words.
Is he part of the commissar class, Tom Wolfe?
Yeah. I mean, he can't even hear the words. So if I say there is no high cabal, what he hears is there is a high cabal.
But don't you think the reason he can't hear the words is because he believes profoundly in the things he's been taught, that this is democracy, that there is freedom. It's like a lot of people like myself who used to be members of the Communist Party and who profoundly believed in the ideals and very painfully let go. Don't you think that there are a lot of honest people, Tom Wolfe being one of them, who profoundly believes in this, and he's not a member of the commissar class, he just has his ideals.
Yeah, but you see, what
and you're threatening, you threaten those ideals.
But see, what you're describing in the Soviet Union is what I would call the commissar class. That is, the people who profoundly believed. I'm sure, I don't know
These
people...
are average people.
Average people,
Right.
but also all the way up to the editors of Pravda. If you did an in-depth analysis with them, how many of them would be total cynics?
Not many.
Yeah, that's right, because most of them completely believe. That's the way systems work. In fact, if you have, the way belief systems form, really, if you think about it, is, we even know this from our personal lives. You sort of decide to do something for whatever reason, and then you create a system of beliefs that justifies it and says, yeah, I was right. Well, the end effect of this is that people who function within a system of power and authority, whether it's an editor of Pravda or an op-ed writer for the Times or a concentration camp guard or, pick across the board, they're usually quite sincere about it. And they have worked up a system of beliefs which says, yes, this is just and right, and I'm completely free and independent. If they couldn't have that system of beliefs, they couldn't continue. Now, the point is but I think when you point out that, I agree with you when you say it's a tight, closed system of beliefs. It's a kind of fundamentalism, which means you simply cannot hear critical analysis. And it's interesting to see what in the United States can't be heard. Ordinary institutional analysis, which says this is the way institutions function in a guided free market system given the distribution of power without any control, no control, nobody's given orders and so on. This is the way it functions because of the way power is distributed. That's much too threatening to listen to, just as it's too threatening to hear the words the United States attacked South Vietnam or the United States orchestrated monstrous atrocities in Central America for those things. It's not allowed.
People get very emotional.
Because there are fundamentalist beliefs involved.
And yet,
It's very easy to, I think we all know it from personal life. You see it with young children. Yeah. You see two kids fighting about a toy, let's say, and the older one takes the toy from the younger one, and his mother comes in and starts berating him. They give you an answer saying, look, it was really mine, and
Yeah.
You know, he took it from me, and he didn't want it anyway. And
Yeah.
he built up a whole story, which the kid probably believes. You know, they're not, and it's. I suspect it's pretty similar when Cheney and Rumsfeld pick the evidence they want to invade another country.
Yeah.
I suspect it's more or less the same mechanisms.
So
So yeah, sure, it is self-deception, but it just it's so automatic. It
Yes.
takes effort and energy to try to see yourself from a distance.
Yes.
It's hard to do.
No, it is. I think in everyday life we're aware of the fact that when we're watching something on stage, so to speak, we have a better view, overall view, than the actors on the stage have. You know, if you can see events laterally and sideways, you can say, my God, they're doing this and they're doing that. But if you're embedded in that network at the time,
It's very hard.
much harder.
In fact, you can see it very clearly by just comparing historical events which are similar. You know, they're never identical, but similar. So say take the Russian invasion of Afghanistan,
Yes.
the Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Just take those three. Well, you know, from the point of view of the people who perpetrated it, it was a noble effort and done for the benefit of everyone. No reason to think they were lying. They had arguments. In fact, the self-justifications are kind of similar. We just cannot adopt towards ourselves the same sane attitudes that we adopt easily, in fact, reflexively, when others commit crimes. It's like your terrorism example. Just can't do it. And if anyone says it, you know, educated people, liberal intellectuals are infuriated because it suggests that we could do something that's not noble. We can make mistakes. That's easy, you know. So you can criticize mistakes. You can criticize low-level crimes, like Abu Ghraib. You can criticize that. You can criticize My Lai, but not the educated, civilized people, the kind of people we have dinner with, you know, see at concerts, sitting in air-conditioned offices, planning mass murder. So that's beyond criticism. On the other hand, if it's half-crazed GIs in the field, uneducated, don't know who's going to shoot at them next, you know, you can blame them, and you can say, look how awful they are. And it's the same. Abu Ghraib is the same. You can criticize Lady England, you know, disadvantaged young woman, very different from us. But how about the guys who organized and planned it?
In these terms, we can also understand another pervasive phenomena, namely the way in which media personnel adapt to the institutional demands. Conformity to the needs and interests of privileged sectors is simply essential to success. In the media, as in other major institutions, those who do not display the requisite values and perspectives will be regarded as irresponsible, ideological, or otherwise aberrant, and they'll fall by the wayside. Now, there'll be a small number of exceptions, but the pattern is pervasive and expected. Those who adapt, and perhaps quite honestly so, those who adapt will then they'll be perfectly free to express themselves with essentially no managerial control, and they'll be able to assert quite accurately that they perceive no pressures to conform. The media are indeed free for those who adopt the principles required for their societal purpose. Now, there may be some who are simply corrupt, who serve as errand boys for the state and other authority. The description of New York Times correspondent Stephen Kinzer by Edgar Chamorro, who was selected by the CIA as a press spokesman for the Contras. But that's not the norm. The media form part of a larger intellectual community where institutional factors induce similar effects, and they do so in the same manner through the normal workings of power. One immediate prediction from these rather natural assumptions is that nothing that I'm now saying could be understood within the general culture. The reason is that to fulfill their societal purpose, responsible intellectuals must conceal from themselves and from others what their societal function is. Otherwise, that function cannot be fulfilled. So it follows that one could demonstrate
quite conclusively, with a huge weight of evidence dealing with every imaginable topic, that the mass media do serve the societal purpose of safeguarding power and privilege, but these results could not be understood. In fact, the words could barely be heard. This prediction, too, is very well confirmed. There's by now a huge mass of evidence in print demonstrating that the media serve their actual societal purpose. The effect of all of that is zero, and I think we could be certain that the evidence, that the effect would remain zero, even if the standards of proof reached those of physics or even surpassed them. There's a good institutional reason for that. Now, the media, in fact, delight in the right-wing jingoist critique that they go too far in their adversarial stance. That provides the occasion for solemn declarations on the need for a cantankerous and obstinate press in a functioning democracy. And furthermore, the criticisms are usually so totally ludicrous that they can be easily refuted. But an accurate description of the media as subservient and conformist is literally unintelligible, and the evidence simply cannot be considered, which makes perfect sense. Again, it's completely explicable on normal grounds of simple institutional analysis.
I think to have the book refer to the media is too narrow, because I think that applies to the whole intellectual class. That's the way intellectuals are, overwhelmingly, all through history. Intellectuals overwhelmingly are servants of power. Now, intellectuals write history, so when you read what they write, they look very noble and adversarial and so on. But when you look at what actually happened, all the criticisms we make of the media apply to them, and that's significant because none of the institutional factors hold in that case. The institutional factors that we looked at have to do with the corporate structure, you know, the advertisers who purchase it, but that's not true.
And that doesn't apply to the academy?
That doesn't apply to a college professor. There are other pressures, but not those. But the outcome is pretty much the same.
I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. You know, it means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, you know, like stupid assignments and things like that, you know that the only people who will make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, you know. So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class, and you want to make it and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, you know. There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, you know. Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity, probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it. You know? Well, all of that is functional. That's the way it works. And it works right through graduate school. I mean, by the time you get to graduate school, it's already a little more varied because some real contradictions develop in the system. The problem is that you can't have progress this way. You know, now, especially in the sciences and engineering, that's a problem because the corporations need science and engineering. You know, if you don't have innovation, you're really in trouble. So they have to encourage creativity and independence because you can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, you know, and thinking new thoughts and so on. And there you got a real contradiction. It's hard to train people to be creative and challenging and so on, and yet to ensure that somewhere else in their lives they're conformist and obedient and never think. There are those contradictions, and when you get to graduate school, they're beginning to show up. They show up much less in the ideological subjects, because there it doesn't matter so much if people have, you know, there isn't, profits aren't made by historians having original ideas about the French Revolution, so they can have conventional ideas. And that means that the pressure to try to support innovation and freedom is much less, and the pressures for conformity, on the other hand, are much greater, because in the ideological subjects it begins to be dangerous if people think the wrong thoughts. It's not so dangerous if they have new ideas about physics. But nevertheless, you know, you begin to get a little flux in the system by the time you get to graduate school. And even at lower levels you find it. I mean, there are teachers who do stimulate thought, and sometimes they get away with it. And all the way through, you know, if people are learning things, you just can't control, you can't make them just regurgitate what they heard. You know, the 60s are now described in the literature as if it was a time when students were running around burning libraries and, you know, destroying the foundations of civilization and so on. What was actually going on is they were asking questions. You know, they were raising questions, they were looking into things that people hadn't looked into before. They were not just obedient. And from the point of view of a lot of the faculty, that's equivalent to burning the buildings. You know, you can't, that small distinction, you can't make that. There's pressure to turn the schools back to the days when you didn't have to worry about those things, like disobedient students asking questions about things that you didn't tell them to think about, and so on.
If the press is a censoring organization, tell me how that works. You're not suggesting that proprietors phone one another up, or that many journalists get their copy spiked, as we say?
It's actually, Orwell, you may recall, has an essay called Literary Censorship in England, which was supposed to be the introduction to Animal Farm, except that it never appeared, in which he points out, look, I'm writing about a totalitarian society, but in free democratic England it's not all that different. And then he says unpopular ideas can be silenced without any force. And then he gives a two-sentence response, which is not very profound, but captures it. He says two reasons. First, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain things appear. But second, the whole educational system, from the beginning on through, just gets you to understand that there are certain things you just don't say. Well, spelling these things out, that's perfectly correct. I mean, it's the first sentence is what we expand on.
This is what I don't get, because it suggests that, I mean, I'm a journalist, people like me are self-censoring.
No, not self-censoring. There's a filtering system that starts in kindergarten and goes all the way through. And it doesn't work 100%, but it's pretty effective. It selects for obedience and subordination. And especially, I think that's...
So stroppy people won't make it to positions of influence.
Behavior problems, or if you read applications to a graduate school, you see that people will tell you he's not, doesn't get along too well with his colleagues. You know how to interpret those things.
I'm just interested in this because I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post the Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
Well, I know some of the best and best-known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because I don't want to, whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know
don't
that
say you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting. Let's say you're the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, or a pundit on the op-ed page, and you want to really have important insights into the government. Well, we all know how that's done. You have lunch with the Secretary of State,
he tells you the lies that he wants to appear tomorrow. You write them and you say, a high source in Washington, my intrepid reporting has discovered that a high source in Washington said so-and-so. In fact, if you compare the internal declassified record, you know, of, say, people like Dean Acheson's decisions, and you look at, say, James Reston's columns, they're pretty close. And the same will be true about James Baker and Thomas Friedman. And furthermore, this is an open secret. We know that this is the way. It's not a big secret in the journalistic profession that this is. Now, in order to maintain those contacts, you better present the world a certain way, or those contacts are going to be cut off. You'll lose your opportunity to have to appear, to have special insight, to have leaks, you know, to be able to come across with a story, you know, a couple hours before the next person, and so on. Plus, you'll now, in order, there's an interplay here which requires power in order to maintain your own power. That's another factor over and above the just structural and institutional properties.
Go along.
Objectivity means you take what people in power say and you report it accurately without distorting their quotes. And then sort of down at the bottom of the column, down at the bottom of the column, you may say things like what I quoted, if you're really an intrepid reporter. You say, well, this may seem to be inconsistent with the spirit of the peace agreement. That's objective reporting. If the State Department announces that Nicaragua has called for revolution without borders, then even if you know it happens to be a lie, an objective reporter just reports it, because they said it, after all. It's true that they said it. And wouldn't be it would be introducing opinions to say it's a lie, I suppose. So there is an ideology of objectivity, and I wouldn't just scoff at it, incidentally. The fact of the matter is that, by and large, American reporters, if you had a bunch of reporters describing something they saw, I would tend, by and large, to trust the American reporter at least as much, maybe more, than those who come out of other traditions. Because this business of objectivity is not completely to be scoffed at. The effort to try to keep your reporting to the facts and not to introduce opinion is a worthy effort, and sometimes it shows up in accurate description. And there are some reporters, I should say, who do it extremely well and have a very good record of it. And in fact, this even includes reporters who work for the journals that, in my view, are right at the core of the propaganda system. So take, say, John Kiffner of the New York Times. I think you can tell when the New York Times editors want some story to be reported accurately for their own purposes. That's when they send John Kiffner to report it, because he's going to report it accurately. And when they don't want it reported accurately anymore, they take him off and put him back at the Metro desk. That's one test as to what the editors have in mind. And there are times when they want stories reported accurately, and there are some journalists who really do it. On the other hand, when they send Tom Friedman out, their current chief diplomatic correspondent, you know what they want is propaganda. You want somebody who's going to say, as he just said after he was advanced to this august post, that the United States is now, sort of under the Bush administration, planning to support the Central American Peace Accords, which were introduced and proposed and advanced by Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The mission there, but that's part of the game. That's what happens when you send Thomas Friedman to report a story. And I presume that the editors understand these things. That's, incidentally, I presume, why Thomas Friedman is chief diplomatic correspondent and John Kiffner isn't, but you'd have to ask the editors about that. So to get back to your point, the objectivity, it's a good thing. It's a good value to be objective in reporting, and the people who do it honestly do very good journalism. But as you're implying, that ideology can be used to be a distorting mechanism, and quite commonly is.
You said somewhere, I think in this new book on power, you can lie or distort the story of the French Revolution as long as you like and nothing will happen. Propose a false theory in chemistry and it'll be refuted tomorrow.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I mean.
Yeah.
Nature is tough. Can't fiddle with Mother Nature. She's a hard taskmistress. So you're forced to be honest in the natural sciences. In the soft fields, you're not forced to be honest. Nobody's going to undermine. I mean, there are standards, of course. On the other hand, they're very weak. And if what you propose is ideologically acceptable, that is supportive of power systems, you can get away with a huge amount. In fact, the difference between the conditions that are imposed on dissident opinion and on mainstream opinion are radically different. I mean, I'll give you concrete examples if you like.
Yeah, do.
Okay, so for example, if I write about terrorism, say I've written about terrorism, and I think you can show without much difficulty that terrorism pretty much corresponds to power. I don't think that's very surprising. But the more powerful states are involved in more terrorism by and large, and the United States is the most powerful, so it's involved in massive terrorism by its own definition of terrorism. Well, if I want to establish that, I'm required to give a huge amount of evidence, and I think that's a good thing. I don't object to that. I think anyone who makes that claim should be held to very high standards. So extensive documentation from the internal secret record, from the historical record, and so on. And if you ever find a comma misplaced, somebody ought to criticize you for it. So I think those standards are fine. All right, now let's suppose that you play the mainstream game. So, for example, Yale University Press just came out with a volume called The Age of Terror. The contributors are leading historians, many of them at Yale, the top people in the field. You read the book, The Age of Terror, first thing you notice is there isn't a single footnote. There isn't a single reference. They're just off the top of your head statements. Some of the statements are tenable, some are untenable, but there are no criteria. There are no intellectual criteria imposed. The reviews of the book are very favorable and laudatory, because, and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. I mean, I happen to think a lot of it's wrong and demonstrably wrong, but it doesn't really matter. You can say anything you want because you're supporting power, and nobody expects you to justify anything. For example, if I was, say, on the unimaginable circumstance that I was on some, say, Nightline, and I was asked to say, do you think Gaddafi is a terrorist? I could say, yeah, Gaddafi's a terrorist. I don't need any evidence. Suppose I said George Bush is a terrorist. Well, then I would be expected to provide evidence. No, you can't just say that.
So you aren't cut off right then.
And in fact, the structure of the news production system is you can't produce evidence. In fact, there's even a name for it. I learned it from the producer of Nightline, Jeff Greenfield. It's called concision. He was asked in an interview somewhere why they didn't have me on Nightline, and his answer was two answers. First of all, he says, well, he talks Turkish, nobody understands it. But the other answer was he lacks concision, which is correct. I agree with him. The kinds of things that I would say on Nightline you can't say in one sentence because they depart from standard religion. If you want to repeat the religion, you can get away with it between two commercials. If you want to say something that questions the religion, you're expected to give evidence, and that you can't do it between two commercials. So therefore you lack concision, so therefore you can't talk. Actually, that's a terrific technique of propaganda. To impose concision is a way of virtually guaranteeing that the party line gets repeated over and over again and that nothing else is heard.
You have said that we live entangled in webs of endless deceit, that we live in a highly indoctrinated society where elementary truths are easily buried. Elementary truths such as?
Such as the fact that we invaded South Vietnam, or the fact that we're standing in the way of significant, and have for years, of significant moves towards arms negotiation, or the fact that the military system is to a substantial extent, not totally, but to a substantial extent, a mechanism by which the general population is compelled to provide a subsidy to high technology industry. Since they're not going to do it if you ask them to, you have to deceive them into doing it. I think there are many truths like that, and I don't think we don't face them. We have an interesting political system in the United States. It's different from those of the other industrial democracies. This is a very free country. I mean, the individuals are, by comparative standards, the state is very restricted in its capacity to coerce and control us. There's very little they can do. Police can't come in and stop us from talking or anything remotely like that. In fact, even as compared with other industrial democracies, we're very free in this respect. On the other hand, the practical limits on those freedoms are unusually high. This is the
practical limits.
Well, there are sophisticated mechanisms that have been devised to prevent us from making use of those freedoms, and furthermore, it has been understood for a long period that in a society that's free, in a society where the state does not have the power to coerce, other mechanisms must be found to ensure that the population doesn't get in the way.
Other mechanisms being?
Indoctrination, elimination of secondary organizations, say unions, other political clubs, ways in which people, for a single isolated individual to participate in a meaningful way in the political system is almost impossible. I mean, you have to have means to inform yourself, to have ideas, to interchange those ideas with others, to turn them into possible programs, to press for those programs. Now that takes access to information, it takes independent media, it requires what sociologists call secondary organizations, means by which isolated people can group together. Active political parties, political clubs. Unions have often played this role in many countries. The United States is unusual in the extent to which all of these structures are weak. So the level of unionization is extremely low, and under the Reagan period has declined even further. Furthermore, the American unions have always been basically apolitical, or largely so. The political system is also unusual. We're the only major industrial democracy that doesn't have a political party which is basically labor-based. We only have one political party with two factions. It's the business party. We have two factions of the business party called the Democrats and the Republicans, and that's unusual.
Admit that we are a free society. That
I admit it. I insist upon it. I insist that we are a free society and that the Soviet Union is a dungeon, and therefore we have completely different methods of population control, completely different methods. In fact, I've written a lot about this. There's no moral equivalence here. The totalitarian, I mean, there's no state is truly totalitarian, but as we move toward the totalitarian end of the spectrum, the technique of control is roughly that satirized by Orwell. You have a center of truth. You have a ministry of truth. It announces official truths. People can believe it or not. Nobody cares very much. It's sufficient that they obey. Totalitarian states can be more or less behavioristic. They don't really care what people think because they always have a club at hand to beat them over the head if they do the wrong thing.
Force people to do what they want to do.
As long as they can think what they like in private, but they better do what we tell them in public. That's the model towards which totalitarian states tend. As a result, the propaganda may very well be not too effective. On the other hand, a democratic state can't use those mechanisms.
Can't force anybody to.
You can't force people. Therefore, you have to control what they think. Since power is still concentrated, but in different hands in our society, largely in private ownership, and you can't control people by force, you'd better care what they think.
So that's
which means you have to have other forms, and in fact more sophisticated forms of indoctrination.
I did an interview once with Edward Bernays, who is considered the pioneering figure in American business public relations, and he talked through there about the engineering of consent.
Yeah, that's his phrase. Yeah. And he thought it's a wonderful thing. In fact, he described it as the essence of democracy.
Yeah, he said that the consent of the government presupposes that efforts at persuasion, at trying to persuade people to see things your way.
Notice the picture. The picture is certain people are in a position to persuade, and the essence of democracy is that they have the freedom to persuade. Now, who has the freedom to persuade? Well, who runs the public relations industry? It's not the special interests. They're the targets of the public relations industry. Public relations industry is a major industry, closely linked to other corporations. And those are the people who have the power to persuade. That's the essence of democracy. Yeah, and they must engineer the consent of others.
There was a vice president of AT&T in 1909 who said that he thought the public mind was the chief danger to the company.
Corporation. Exactly. The general public might have funny ideas about corporate control. For example, people who really believe in democracy, people who take 18th century values seriously, people who really might merit the term conservatives, that much abused term, are against concentration of power. They remember that after all, the doctrines of the Enlightenment held that individuals should be free from the coercion of concentrated power. Now, the kind of concentrated power that they were thinking about was the church and the state and the feudal system and so on. And you could sort of imagine a population of relatively equal people, at least equal white male property owners, who would be not controlled by those private powers. But in the subsequent period, a new form of power developed, namely corporations, with highly concentrated power over decision-making in economic life. That is, they control over what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on and so forth, is very narrowly concentrated.
So this is why the vice president of a large corporation would say the public mind is the chief thing.
The public mind might have funny ideas about democracy, which say that we should not be forced simply to rent ourselves to the people who own the country, rather, and own its institutions. Rather, we should play a role in determining what those institutions do. That's democracy. If we were to move towards democracy, and I think democracy even in the 18th century sense, we would say that there should be no maldistribution of power in determining what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on. Rather, that should be, that's a problem for the entire community. In fact, there are, in my own personal view, unless we move in that direction, human society probably isn't going to survive.
Why?
Well, we now face the most awesome problems of human history, problems such as the likelihood of nuclear conflict, either among the superpowers or through proliferation, the destruction of a fragile environment, which finally we're beginning to recognize, that was obvious decades ago that we're heading for disaster. Other problems of this nature, they're of a level of seriousness that they never were in the past.
But why do you think more participation by the public, more democracy is the answer?
Because, well, more democracy is a value in itself. So quite apart from, because democracy is a value, it doesn't have to be defended any more than freedom has to be defended. It's just, it's part of, it's an essential feature of human nature that people should be free, they should be able to participate, they should be uncoerced, and so on.
So
these are values in themselves.
Right. Why do you think, if we go that route,
because I think that that's the only hope that I can see, that other values will come to the fore. I mean, if the society is based on control by private wealth, it will reflect the values that it in fact does reflect, the value that the highest, the only real human property is the desire is greed and the desire to maximize personal gain at the expense of others. Now, any society, maybe a small society based on that principle is ugly, but it can survive. A global society based on that principle is headed for massive destruction, and that's what we are. We have to have a mode of social organization that reflects other values that I think are inherent in human nature that people recognize.
And that would be, I want to see exactly what you mean.
I mean, what are human beings? I mean, in your family, for example, it's not the case that in the family every person tries to maximize personal gain at the expense of others, or if they do, it's kind of pathological. It's not the case that if you and I are, say, walking down the street and we see a child eating a piece of candy and we see that nobody's around, and we happen to be hungry, we don't steal it. If we did that, we would be pathological. I mean, the idea of care for others and concern for other people's needs and concern for a fragile environment that must sustain future generations, all of these things are part of human nature. These are elements of human nature that are suppressed in a social and cultural system which is designed to maximize personal gain. And I think we must try to overcome that suppression, and that's in fact what democracy could bring about. It could lead to the expression of other human needs and values which tend to be suppressed under the institutional structure of a system of private power and private profit.
This contrary view can be traced back to the origins of modern democracy in the 17th century English Revolution, when for the first time there was a challenge to the right of authority, whether it was the gentry or the king or whatever, and there was actually the beginnings of a real radical democratic movement with a commitment on the part of the people involved, who were very widespread in England, to public involvement and control over affairs. They didn't want to be ruled by the king, and they didn't want to be ruled by Parliament. They wanted to run their own affairs. And they were defeated. The radical Democrats were defeated, but not before doing some important things which had a lasting effect. Well, what I'm interested now is the reaction to this. The reaction to the first efforts at popular democracy, radical democracy you might call it, were a good deal of fear and concern. One historian of the time, Clement Walker, warned that these guys who were putting out pamphlets on their little printing presses and distributing them and agitating in the army and telling people how the system really worked, were having an extremely dangerous effect. They were revealing the mysteries of government. And he said that's dangerous because it will, I'm quoting him, it will make people so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule. And that's a problem. John Locke, a couple of years later, explained what the problem was. He said day laborers and tradesmen, the spinsters and the dairymaids, must be told what to believe. The greater part cannot know, and therefore they must believe. And of course someone must tell them what to believe. Now, there's a modern version of that, and of course he didn't just mean those categories, he meant the general public. There's a modern version of that. This goes all the way up to the modern times. It's discussed in the American Revolution and all the way through to the modern period, but let's just come up to the contemporary period. Now, in the modern period, you get a much more sophisticated development of these ideas. So, for example, Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a much respected moralist and commentator on world affairs, he wrote that rationality belongs to the cool observers, but because of the stupidity of the average man, he follows not reason but faith. And this naive faith requires that necessary illusions be developed. Emotionally potent oversimplifications have to be provided by the myth makers to keep the ordinary person on course because of the stupidity of the average man. That's the same view, basically. Walter Lippmann, who was the dean of American journalists, is the man who invented the phrase manufacture of consent. He described the manufacture of consent as a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. This, he said, is quite important. This is a revolution in the practice of democracy. And he thought it was a worthwhile revolution. The reason is, again, the stupidity of the average man. The common interests, he said, very largely elude public opinion entirely, and they can be managed only by a specialized class whose personal interests reach beyond the locality. That's Niebuhr's cool observers. You can guess who's part of them. The person who pronounces these views is always part of that group. It's the others who aren't. This is in Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, which appeared shortly after World War I, and the timing is important. World War I was a period in which the liberal intellectuals, John Dewey's circle primarily, were quite impressed with themselves for their success, as they described in their own words, for their success in having imposed their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority. Now, there was a problem in World War I. The problem was that the population was, as usual, pacifistic and didn't see any particular reason in going out and killing Germans and getting killed. If the Europeans want to do that, that's their business. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson won the 1916 election on a mandate which was peace without victory. That's how he got elected. And not surprisingly, he interpreted that as meaning victory without peace. And the problem was to get this reluctant and indifferent majority and get them to be to create emotionally potent oversimplifications and necessary illusions so that they would then be properly jingoistic and support this great cause. And the liberal intellectuals were convinced that they were the ones who had primarily succeeded in doing this, and they thought it was a very good task for obvious reasons. And in fact, they probably had some role, whether they had as much role as they think you could question, but some role. They used all sorts of necessary illusions. For example, fabrications about Hun atrocities, Belgian babies with their arms torn off, and all sorts of things that were concocted by the British Foreign Service and fed to the educated classes in the United States, who picked them up and were quite enthusiastic about them and distributed them. They used such devices as what they called historical engineering. There was a phrase proposed by Frederick Paxson, an American historian, who was the founder of a group called the National Board for Historical Service. That was a group of historians who got together to serve the state by explaining the issues of the war that we might better win it. That's historical engineering. The Wilson administration established the country's, I think, first official propaganda agency. It's called the Creel Commission, which was dedicated to convincing this reluctant or indifferent majority that they'd better be properly enthusiastic about the war that they were opposed to. That had some institutional consequences. In fact, there were a number of institutional consequences to this whole period. One was the institution of the National Political Police, the FBI, which has been dedicated to thought control and repression of freedom ever since. That's its primary activity. And another development, institutional development, was the enormous growth of the public relations industry. A lot of people learned lessons from the capacity to control the public mind, as they put it, slogan of the public relations industry. One of the people who came out of the Creel Commission was a man named Edward Bernays, who became the patron saint of the public relations industry. That's a big, substantial industry, which is actually an American creation, though it's since spread throughout other parts of the world. It's dedicated to controlling the public mind, again, quoting its publications, to educate the American people about the economic facts of life, to ensure a favorable climate for business, and, of course, a proper understanding of the common interests. Bernays developed the concept of engineering of consent, which he said is the essence of democracy. And of course, didn't bother saying that there are only some groups who are in a position to carry out the engineering of consent, those who have the power and the resources. It's what the public relations industry is for corporate purposes, and what the media are for if they properly serve the state. Well, that's, notice again, we have a view that says the media should not function the way the standard rhetoric claims. There's also an academic twist to this. It's come closer to home. If you go back to the International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, published in 1933, days when people were a little more open and honest in what they said, there's an article on propaganda, and it's well worth reading. There's an entry under propaganda. The entry is written by a leading, maybe the leading American political scientist, Harold Lasswell, who was very influential, particularly in this area, communications and so on. And in this entry in the International Encyclopedia on propaganda, he says, we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. He said, even with the rise of mass education, doesn't mean that people can judge their own interests. They can't. The best judges of their interests are elites, the specialized class, the cool observers, the people who have rationality, and therefore they must be granted the means to impose their will, notice, for the common good, because, again, well, he says, because of the ignorance and superstition of the masses, he said it's necessary to have a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda. Propaganda, he says, we shouldn't have a negative connotation about it. It's neutral. Propaganda, he says, is as neutral as a pump handle. You can use it for good, you can use it for bad. Since we're good people, obviously, that's sort of true by definition. We'll use it for good purposes, and there should be no negative connotations about that. In fact, it's moral to use it, because that's the only way that you can save the ignorant and stupid masses of the population from their own errors. You don't let a 3-year-old run across the street, and you don't let ordinary people make their own decisions. You have to control them. And why do you need propaganda? Well, he explains that. He says in military-run or feudal societies, what we would these days call totalitarian societies, you don't really need propaganda that much. And the reason is you've got a club in your hand. You can control the way people behave, and therefore it doesn't matter much what they think, because if they get out of line, you can control them for their own good, of course. But once you lose the club, once the state loses its capacity to coerce by force, then you have some problems. The voice of the people is heard. You got all these formal mechanisms around that permit people to express themselves and even participate and vote and that sort of thing. And you can't control them by force because you lost that capacity. But the voice of the people is heard, and therefore you've got to make sure it says the right thing. And in order to make sure it says the right thing, you've got to have effective and sophisticated propaganda, again, for their own good. So as a society becomes more free, that is, there's less capacity to coerce, it simply needs more sophisticated indoctrination and propaganda for the public good.
There's always a fringe of dissidents. Any society you look at, there's a fringe of dissidents. They're treated badly, usually. I mean, this goes back to the earliest recorded history. So classical Greece, who drank the hemlock? It was the guy who was corrupting the youth by worshiping false gods, you know. And it wasn't the guys who followed orders. Or take a look at the same time, the other ancient records we have are the biblical records. In the biblical records, there are people who we would call intellectuals. They weren't, in the English translations, it's called prophets. That's a bad translation of a very obscure Hebrew word which nobody understands. And they weren't prophets. They didn't prophesy. They were dissident intellectuals. You know, they condemned the evil king. They gave geopolitical analysis. Said, you're leading us into disaster. You should be merciful to widows and orphans. These are dissident intellectuals. How were they treated? They were imprisoned, thrown into the desert. One of them, Elijah, was called a hater of Israel, Ocher Yisrael, by the epitome of evil in the Bible, King Ahab. That's the first use that I know of this notion, self-hating Jew. You know, it's King Ahab referring to the prophet Elijah. You know, and they were all treated badly. Now there were people who were treated well, flatterers at the court. A couple of centuries later, they were condemned as false prophets, and that's very typical. In fact, I don't know of a society where that's not true.
But I've heard it said, just on this point about you, that if the argument that you've just advanced in manufacturing consent was completely right, the book should have gone nowhere, and you should have been an obscure figure who was shoved to the margins. But the fact that you are this giant figure and the book is still cited and quoted...
Not because of me, it's because of the popular movement. When I started giving talks about the Vietnam War in early 1960s, I was giving talks in somebody's living room or a church with 4 people, the minister, the organizer, a guy who wanted to kill me, and a drunk who walked off the streets. And that went on for quite a while. Finally, a popular movement developed, and when popular movements develop, people who have some degree of privilege can float above them. Actually, the same was true of Martin Luther King. I'm sure he would have been the first to say, if it hadn't been for young students sitting in lunch counters and riding freedom buses and getting beaten to a pulp by state troopers and everything that grew from that, nobody would have heard him either.